CrossFit Open Workout 21.1 was an ascending amount of wall walks and double unders. Wall walks, it went 1, 3, 6, 9, 15, and 21. Double unders 10, 30, 60, 90, 150, 210. And for a lot of people, it came down to just their ability to have shoulder endurance and to be able to have really good wall walk capacity. And for that same reason, a lot of people wrote it off as not a very good test of like quote unquote fitness as a result. And then at the CrossFit Games in that same year, it reappeared for the first time at that level with an ascending amount of heavy thrusters and wall walks, 1 to 10, for a total of 55 as the volume, which is ironically the same thing as 21.1. And I think a lot of people at that point kind of chalked it up to like, it's just like a theme for the season. Like, you know, Dave had done before, like a no barbell regional. So it was just sort of something that he was choosing to be his like pet thing. Fast forward 2 years down the road, and we've seen the wall walk now appear in both opens since then. So in 2022, it came up in 22.1, which was a 15-minute AMRAP, 3 wall walk, 12 dumbbell snatch, 15 box jump over, which a lot of people are getting well into the 30 plus wall walks in that workout in terms of the volume. And then for open 23.3, there was wall walks, snatches, and double unders as a buy-in to future rounds with handstand push-ups in it. So love them or hate them, they're here to stay. It's time to build your wall walk capacity. The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. So today's episode, just as it sounds, I'm going to be covering how to build capacity. That is different than efficiency. However, obviously those are going to be very closely linked. So technique will be part of the conversation here. However, I'm not going to go over specifics of how to actually do the wall walk because I've put out plenty of resources on that already. I will link to those in the show notes. The first is our movement page, where we are going to go over in detail execution and technique of the wall walk to help you optimize for that. We have technique videos out on the wall walk as well. I'll put it all in the show notes, zorfitness.com/podcast/099. So here we're focusing more on addressing limitations from a more of a training based approach rather than just strictly a technique of like how you can actually do the movement. So we're still focusing on quality, still focusing on the technique. However, here we're thinking about how can we incorporate this into a larger design in order to make sense and actually improve someone's technique and ultimately improve their capacity. So when we go to build an athlete's capacity in a movement, regardless of what movement is, you got to figure out like what is the thing that's slowing you down? What is your rate limiting process? What is your limiter? What is your weakness? So in this case, I've kind of boiled it down into 4 different buckets that I think this could be appropriate for, that we're going to put most of the people into one or multiples of these. It's very possible that people have overlap, and I think that's probably actually the most common scenario is that people have overlap. One is position and inversion comfort. So how comfortable are you upside down? What does it look like when you get upside down? 2, pressing muscle fatigue. So triceps, delts, especially there. 3, midline muscle fatigue. 4, respiratory stress. And we could probably call that more like systemic fatigue there as well. That would probably be appropriate. So let's get into first position and inversion comfort. There's a couple different prerequisites of positions that someone's going to need to be really effective at wall walks. A lot of the best athletes, if you go and watch a Mal or an Emma Carey or a Danielle Brannon do wall walks, they all have incredible overhead positions, and they can achieve those positions as soon as they get their feet onto the wall. So very early on in those reps, they're able to achieve the correct position and stay stacked throughout the entirety of that rep. And that's what allows for extreme efficiency in a movement like that. So the first position that's a kind of a prerequisite is that nose to wall, right? Is to be able to get that hollow body position with a neutral rib cage, because that's another thing that we're gonna see down the road when people are dealing with breathing limitations, respiratory issues. Is often because their rib cage relative to their pelvis is getting misaligned somehow and they're not able to ventilate properly. The total work that's actually required for a wall walk relative to other cyclical modalities is pretty low. Like, you're not producing that much metabolic work. It's more so the fact that you can get pulled out of position, that your blood pressure can get elevated because you're upside down. Some of those other factors often play a much bigger role than just the fact that you're working hard. Next is a stacked position. So stacked, I mean that you are able to support your body weight with your skeletal system. So in other words, if you were to, for example, like do a jerk and leave it out in front, you're obviously going to probably miss that rep, especially if it's heavy. However, that's what a lot of people end up being early on. And when they get their feet up onto the wall in their wall walk, they have this kind of closed off shoulder position where their armpit isn't truly open all the way. And that doesn't really allow them to, like I said, use their skeleton and actually support their body weight. And it's for that exact same reason that, weightlifters, cheerleaders, gymnasts, people who are doing like tumbling and things like that, or are able to support really heavy loads over their head. They're the center of mass of whatever object they're holding, whether that's a person over their head, whether it's a barbell with a, loaded super heavy over their head. It goes right down through the midline of their body. And that's what I mean by sort of having that stacked skeleton. And then all of the other musculature is going to work in a way that's sort of a little bit more balanced as a result of you being able to get into that position. So when I say a stacked skeleton, that's what I mean. It allows you to basically load not just the delt, especially if that shoulder is still a little bit closed off and not in complete flexion. It allows it to get transferred not just to the delt, but to the upper back, to the traps, to the whole system of the shoulder and the multiple joints of the shoulder, and not just the glenohumeral joint with the delt taking a lot of the brunt of the work throughout the wall walk. So when we're thinking about position and inversion comfort, the first thing is like, can you actually get into the position, right? So do you have the passive range of motion that is required to get into the position? Like, can you manipulate yourself into the position without being under load? So without having to hold a barbell over your head, can you pull yourself into a position where your arms are over your head, right? Maybe like holding onto a box, push your chest down towards the floor, like that elevated cat type position. Are you able to actually get into the range of motion? If you can, great. And oftentimes I would say like people are probably already starting to lack in that department. However, typically this next step is really where we start to see it. Whereas now, do you have control of that range of motion? So it's active range of motion. Ideally, there's a very small gap between passive range of motion and active range of motion. So the range of motion that we have, that the athlete has, that they can use every ounce of that range of motion are very close. They're pretty efficient in their ability to use the range of motion that they currently have. So that's super important because you're actually going to be working and pushing your way through the range much more actively. It's not like you can really use gravity to help assist you into the movement with something like a wall walk. That's just not super realistic. So you need to have the active range of motion is next. 3, can you get into that position when you're actually inverted? So have some skill transfer. It's one thing if you can hold a barbell over your head or a set of dumbbells over your head and get into a stacked position. It's another thing if you can do it when you're upside down, right? For whatever reason, some people have no issues with that at all, right? If they had a background where they were doing a lot of body orientation changes, whether they were a wrestler or a gymnast or something along those lines, or if it's someone who they haven't had exposure to any of that type of stuff and they're having to figure out how to navigate being upside down and that body awareness just isn't quite there to the same degree, then that's something that you're going to have to just spend some time building the comfort of being upside down, which is something that, just spending more time literally being inverted in a number of different settings is going to be super helpful for anybody who's dealing with that skill transfer limitation. And then step 4 is basically like, do you stay in that position? Like if you're able to get in that position, you're able to do it when you're upside down. Can you stay in that position as you become fatigued, right? So as you get tired, even if you have to slow down a little bit, does that change? Or are you able to lean into the correct position as you fatigue? In certain movements for the elite level athletes, as they get tired, their technique actually improves, which is something that is very rare. But if you do have that skill, it's a very hard thing to teach as well. However, if you do have that skill, obviously that's extremely helpful. That's gonna be tough in something like a wall walk, but I think it is something that's really good and helpful to think about and strive for. So for sample training protocols here, I really think that it could just be as simple as like you need to spend a little bit more time working on your mobility, stretching out more frequently, doing that before you ideally would go in and do a session for wall walks. Like spend some time in the positions that you need before you actually go and warm up and do that early enough where it doesn't impact your session in a positive way. Or you could do something like along these lines, right? You give an athlete like a 15-minute clock. You say, here's a demo of this. Here's some technique videos on this. Here's an athlete doing this that has similar body type and is really good at wall walks and someone that you could emulate. And you're just going to demo or watch that demo and then try to emulate them as closely as you can, right? Try to mimic what they're doing, video yourself, watch it back, try to improve again, right? It's just that refinement process of going through, seeing what it looks like, making a little tweak, see if it helps, see if it gets worse, right? That's just the process of practice, right? Trying to refine your technique. Another way that you could write something like that would be like every 45 seconds for 20 reps, you're doing one wall walk for ease and comfort, right? So rather than trying to do it as quickly as you can, it's like, hey, make these the best body lines, the best shapes, right? And the smoothest movement that you possibly can. And then certainly like for an individual athlete, you could add notes about like the stuff that they're particularly working on. Like, hey, you haven't claimed that nose to wall position early enough, so make sure you're driving that nose to where the floor meets the wall right off the bat. Stuff like that will be super helpful. Or it could be something like 8 to 12 rounds for quality, 20-second elevated cat pose, where you're really actively pulling the delts open or pulling with your delts to open up your shoulder and driving your shoulders down, squeezing your abs, pulling your ribs down, trying to get into the deepest stretch that you can into a very active position, rest a couple seconds, and then go into one wall walk where you're pausing halfway up, making sure you're in really nice positions where you have a completely open shoulder, nose is driven towards the wall, neutral pelvis, rib cage is pulled in, right? All those nice, clean positions, and then you finish the wall walk. Or it could be like wall walk, 6 sets of 3 reps, where you rest as long as you need to keep those reps unbroken, so to speak, but also at like 4 steps on the way up, 3 steps on the way down, right? So rest as long as you need to keep that quality and that step count going. Do you have a topic that you'd like to request as a future show or just a question about training? Reach out to me. My email is ben@zorfitness.com, or you can DM me on Instagram @zorfitness. Lastly, head over to zorfitness.com if you want to browse all of our previous shows with in-depth show notes, as well as educational content for all things training. So moving on, one of the things that I particularly find most noticeable, and I think doesn't take long for you doing a wall walk to figure this out, but the cycle speed for wall walks is really slow, right? They take a long time to just do a rep of a wall walk. Like even if you're like sprinting them, and like the best athletes are taking 4 to 5 seconds a rep to get through a single wall walk. And for a lot of people who are a little bit less refined, as they get tired and as they aren't super confident and they're taking a lot of steps on the way up, a lot of steps on the way down, and they're trying to meet the standard, it might be like 7 to 10 seconds. So that relative to the cycle speeds that we see a lot of other like more traditional CrossFit movements at, like they're often like 2 to 3 seconds. And here we're literally double that, if not more. So just the time under tension of the musculature is something that can't go unnoticed here. So like in particular, when I think about these next 2 segments here, where we think about the pressing musculature, especially with the tricep, and as we think about the midline musculature and just how those can be impacted and fatigued, it makes sense that, okay, yeah, like these reps take a really long time to get through and there's no break for that musculature. Like you have to get through the entire rep before you can even potentially deload that or detension that, then it just makes it more challenging for those muscles. So in particular, I'm thinking like that end range lockout of the elbow, right? Because you have to keep that strong elbow lockout throughout if you want to be efficient with it. And then 2 is just having, like essentially you do a plank with your feet up on the wall. And a lot of people are like, well, planks aren't super hard. Well, it's a whole lot harder if you're at like 170 beats per minute and you're hyperventilating. It makes it way more challenging. And then when your blood pressure gets up because you are upside down, again, more challenging. So I think if we understand that there is definitely more inherent challenges to the wall walk, even though it's relatively simple, it's demanding in a lot of ways, in particular in the pressing and the midline musculature. So let's dive into pressing. If you're someone who's dealing with like a crazy amount of like delt fatigue, just like the ball muscle of your shoulder, it's very likely, in my opinion at least, that you don't have super efficient wall walk technique where you're not driving your nose to the wall early enough and getting into a stacked position where your skeleton is supporting your structure quick enough. Because if you do that, you should really minimize the amount of delt fatigue that you get, and that should be much more generalized across, trap, upper back, and a lot of the other muscles, and not just focus solely on the delt. So if your delts are really blowing up, I'd probably go back and say, hey, there's probably something going on here besides, just having a lack of delt muscle endurance. Could be the case, but probably relatively unlikely. If you're someone who's dealing with a lot of tricep fatigue, again, it could be the same thing where you're just not getting into terminal elbow extension, like that very last little bit of range of motion. And as a result, you're having to use your muscles to continue to drive up against that end range rather than using your skeleton to support it. So it could be the sort of the same idea. So if that is you, the first thing I would probably do is like ask yourself, like, do I also struggle with other movements where I need terminal elbow extension? So things as simple as like burpees could be one example, but even more so like jerks, snatches, snatch balances, overhead squats, overhead walking lunges, stuff where you're having to hold that terminal elbow extension, that could definitely be an issue. Or if you're someone who, if we go back to the beginning, it was like your position isn't quite what it could be, where you have a lot of bicep tension. Bicep tension can essentially prevent you from going up against that end range and be able to fully extend your elbow. Similar if you have like really tight hip flexors, it's going to be hard for you to extend your hips, right? So if you have really tight biceps, it's going to be hard for your triceps to claim that full range of motion. Likewise, if you don't have a great, shoulder flexion ability to get your arms over your head, other movements that you have like an arch for like ring muscle ups and stuff doesn't often feel great. Like your snatches and jerks don't always have a great position. Like double dumbbell overhead walking lunges, things like that are very challenging, and you find yourself wanting to bend your elbows to try to cheat the range of motion a little bit. If you notice those sorts of things, then again, you should probably go back to position, but that will be one of the reasons why potentially you have more tricep fatigue than you would need to have, or then would be ideal for something like this. So if that's the case, you got to go back to position and start working on the position itself, and probably in a little bit more isolated manner, like work on your mobility, but then also work on like as simple as it is like planks, FLR holds on the low rings, right? Where we're really focused on driving that elbow all the way to that full, very last bit of range of motion, and just making sure that you hit that really clean, crisp lockout every single rep on things like jerks and snatches, and demanding that of yourself when you're doing wall walks, right? Keeping that terminal elbow extension the entire time. Sample training protocols, not super fancy. For again, it could be just like a 15-minute clock where you're, mobilizing your lats, you're stretching your foam rolling, you're hitting your T-spine, you're hitting your biceps. All of those muscle groups could be certainly helpful in like developing the lockout. And then performing sets of exercises that just require that terminal elbow extension, like I said, like snatches, like jerks, like wall walks, like, even planks and, handstand walks are all great examples of needing that straight arm pressing ability. I'll give two other examples that are kind of more like training based examples. 5 sets, resting 2 minutes between, 15 calorie ski at 12 to 1300 calories per hour, 3 wall walks, where again, the focal point for those wall walks is fighting for that strong elbow lockout. As soon as that hand gets planted on the ground, making sure that you get that strong elbow lockout. Another example, 3 to 5 sets, just resting a good recovery between 5 parallel dips with a 1-second pause at the top of each of those. Rest 15 seconds. 10 dumbbell push presses with a 1-second pause at the top of each. Rest 15 seconds. 15 push-ups as fast as possible. Rest 15 seconds. And 3 to 5 wall walks for quality at that point. Again, still focusing on that really strong elbow position and driving through the entire time. The third limitation is midline muscle fatigue. And as I said, people who are dealing with local fatigue in the tricep are often dealing with getting out of position, just like they are often getting out of position in the midline work. So it's very common to see an athlete who's dealing with one of these to be dealing with other ones. So for example, the person who's dealing with the position limitation, they can't really claim that really strong lockout because they can't get into that full terminal elbow extension, right? For someone in this case, they probably aren't able to keep a really good neutral midline when they're doing a lot of other CrossFit movements. It just gets exacerbated a lot when they're actually doing CrossFit work. So they can focus on doing quality wall walks. However, you need to also address their movement as a whole outside of just doing wall walks. And I think doing midline work is one piece in the puzzle of that. It needs to be incorporated in breathing. It needs to be incorporated in mixed work. It needs to have a little bit more holistic approach and like teaching the athlete how to move properly as a whole. You know, understanding where their pelvic orientation should be relative to their rib cage, understanding how to breathe in different workout scenarios. There's a lot that goes in that and could be under that. However, this is probably one piece in that puzzle. So let's go over some of the sample training protocols here. 10-minute clock, wall walk, body line focused, unfatigued practice. That's basically word salad for saying like try to do wall walks that are really clean. Don't do it when you're tired. And then you could go into like 3 to 5 sets where you're resting 3 minutes between. 500-meter row at a 3K time trial pace, 5 wall walks. Again, focusing on their best positions for each of those wall walks, not trying to just blaze through reps rather than, you know, I know you're tired. I know that you just did this fixed paced work, but now focus on making these reps as quality as you possibly can and not rushing through them, but also not recovering before you get to them. That's a tough balance to orchestrate, but if you can figure it out, that's a good place to be on things like that. So you could do a training-based protocol like that. I think for a lot of people, incorporating some focused midline work, especially for anterior core, is only going to be helpful, and in particular, isometric anterior core work. So things like this: planks with your hands on the wall, kneeling overhead planks. So just as it sounds, you're on your knees, but your hands are all the way up over your head, almost like a finish to like an inchworm plank. FLR holds in the low rings. So it's like a low ring push-up finish position. GHD sit-up isometric hold at parallel. So basically like a Chinese plank on the GHD. Barbell rollouts, or even with an ab wheel. We have one of those at the gym. Straight arm lat pull downs. Again, that could be a lat exercise, but it also ties in the anterior core. Inchworm planks, right? All those sorts of things are going to tie in the anterior core in a way that is isometrically demanding for that musculature, which is sort of the name of the game of what you're going for. So here's another training example. It's sort of the best of both worlds where you're tying in the midline, but it's also going to exacerbate any respiratory fatigue, because again, a lot of people who are dealing with midline stuff, that comes as a result of having some diaphragmatic fatigue that is causing someone to get pulled out of position because they don't have the fatigue resistance in that musculature either. So often like a chicken or the egg thing. In this case, I think it's often that the fact that the athlete gets in respiratory distress and then the midline falls apart, sort of in that order. But when you train them, you can kind of put them in tandem, and I think that works pretty well. And this might be a decent example of that. 3 to 5 sets, rest 3 minutes between, 60-second air bike at your 10-minute test average RPMs. Immediately end a 30-second FLR hold on the low rings where you focus on a posterior pelvic tilt. Basically like trying to keep your tailbone tucked, maintaining the orientation of pelvis and rib cage, and then immediately into 30 seconds on the air bike again at your 10-minute test pace, this time plus 2 to 3 RPMs above that, and then immediately into 3 wall walks, again, where you're focused on maintaining your best midline and positions as you go about those reps. So 3 to 5 sets of that. And then finally is the respiratory stress. And as I said, these are all blending into each other. Oftentimes, an athlete who is dealing with respiratory issues, just in the fact that they aren't able to maintain their positions really well as their respiration rate climbs, they either get panicked, they feel like they can't continue to move through reps appropriately, or their position breaks down, or potentially all three. But likely their position starts to break down, and oftentimes that's more so something that's coming up as like a midline deviation of what like optimal technique would be, more so than other stuff, right? Like your limbs don't have as much of a direct negative impact from respiratory fatigue, other than it could be like, you know, like blood stealing, essentially, like you're preserving yourself and your vital organs. But without going too deep down the physiology rabbit hole, like it makes sense that like, oh, where I'm actually drawing a negative pressure gradient, like where I'm creating that with my diaphragm, my intercostals, like around my ribs, around my belly, that's where is often going to be taxed other musculature as well, where that's going to be the position that starts to break down, right? My midline is going to start to break down because that's where I'm initiating breathing. Makes sense. So here are some sample training protocols that you could do. I'll say, first of all, like you could just put this into Metcons and ideally that wouldn't be like random doses of Metcons with wall walks in them. Does work for some athletes sometimes, but maybe a good thing to think about when you'd be programming that type of work, whether it's for yourself or an athlete that you have, would be to create pretty small chunks of work, but requiring those chunks of work to be at a pretty fast rate of execution as the athletes are going through the reps. So here would be an example, and this would be sort of like that 22.1 this could actually be a pretty good progression for something like 22.1, maybe like 2 to 3 weeks before someone would test that. It would be 3 sets, resting 3 minutes between on the air bike. That just kind of keeps somebody's cardiac output up a little bit and allows them to, it requires them to obviously recover a little bit more actively. AMRAP for 5 minutes at 85 to 90% effort. So this each is supposed to be pretty hard. 2 wall walks, 6 dumbbell snatches, 50-35, 8 box jump overs, 24-20. So the exact same format, but the reps are pulled back. So it's more of a 20.2 feel where you're kind of a dog chasing your tail and you got these short little circuits that you're flying through the entire time and these smaller breaks, but it keeps the turnover really high, the respiration high, but it doesn't allow the movement to break down nearly as quickly. This next one is exactly the same as the one from the midline one. 3 to 5 sets, rest 3 minutes between, 500-meter row at your 3K time trial pace, 5 wall walks where you're focusing on quality in your best positions. Again, oftentimes, if you do have something that's overlapping, the protocols that you could use can overlap as well. So these can be appropriate on multiple fronts. Last example here, 3 to 4 sets, resting 3 minutes between, 30-second air bike at your 10-minute test, average RPMs, 2 wall walks for quality. Right back on the bike, 30 seconds at 10-minute test, plus that RPMs plus 5. So 5 extra RPMs. So say your 10-minute test RPMs was like me and it was like 69 RPMs, then you'd be going 74 RPMs. And then get back off, 2 more wall walks for quality. And then you get back on, and now it's plus 10 RPMs for that last 30 seconds. So again, for me, it would be now at 79 RPMs for that last 30 seconds. Jump back off, 2 more wall walks for quality. Rest 3 minutes and repeat 3 to 4 times. So thanks for listening today. I hope you picked up some helpful tools in how to build your wall walk capacity. Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.